Hey there, welcome back to the quiet side of time. Tonight, we drift into chambers carved for the quiet, where the walls remember names, and bread was shaped for ghosts. Clay trays wait in the dark, holding offerings no hand will eat. Stillness wraps around sandstone, slow as linen. Dim the lights. Let your breath loosen. Place your thoughts beside the pillow. If calm stories like this help you rest, you can tap subscribe. Now I've saved something rare for the very end. But first, a door carved in silence, a hunger older than history, and bread that outlived its baker. In the dry hush of the necropolis, where the wind sifted endlessly through sand and stone, there stood doors that no hand could open. They were carved into the walls of tombs, flat, silent, unmoving. But to those who once lived in ancient Egypt, these were not decorations. They were thresholds. False doors, they were called now, by archaeologists and dreamers. But to the ancients, they were anything but false. They were portals, passages, breathing places for the spirit of the dead. Each one bore the name of the tomb's inhabitant, not shouted, not written for display, but inscribed in quiet devotion, deep enough to last, soft enough to invite. Hieroglyphs trailed down the sides like whispered prayers, symbols for bread, for beer, for meat, symbols for eternity. Each request carved into limestone, as if the dead might reach through and take what was offered. And they believed it could happen. The false door was placed on the west wall of the tomb, the side of the setting sun, the side of endings, of descent, but also, perhaps, of return. It was shaped like a real door, a central panel for the spirit to emerge through, with a low table or shelf beneath it, waiting for food, waiting for scent, waiting for ritual. The priests and family would come with baskets, loaves wrapped in linen, still warm from the ovens, jars of beer foaming at the rim, slices of ox meat, salted and spiced. Sometimes it was real, sometimes it was clay. It did not matter. What mattered was that it was placed there, on the threshold. What mattered was that it was offered. The dead, they believed, could pass through the false door, just for a moment, not in body, but in essence, in breath, in memory, in ka, the part of the soul that needed nourishment. It lived after the body died, but it hungered still. Without food, the ka would grow weak, lonely. It might become restless, might wander, might whisper into the dreams of the living, forgotten and afraid. But if the offerings were made, if the door was honored, then peace would remain, and the dead would stay full. The shape of the door echoed older memories still, even before the great stone temples, before the pyramids. Tombs had doors. It was a gesture of belief, not architecture, a way of saying, they are not truly gone. In Saqqara and Thebes, and far beneath the shifting dunes, some of these doors remain. They lean against time like old thresholds no one dares to cross. Still carved, still named, still waiting. One door belonged to a man named Nebamun, another to a woman named Hanut Mehit. Their names were painted and chiseled and blessed. A hand might run across the cool stone now and feel the faint indent of a reed symbol. A basket, an open mouth. The hieroglyph for to eat was shaped like a bowl and a mouth. Together, they meant offering. Together, they meant eternity. Even when the food rotted, even when the priests forgot, the names remained. And names, the Egyptians believed, were a kind of survival. To say the name was to keep the soul alive. To forget the name was to lose it forever. So they carved the names into the door, and beside them, they painted scenes. A man seated at a table piled with offerings, his wife behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, servants approaching with baskets, musicians playing to the silence, a meal that would never end. Sometimes these scenes were layered, hundreds of tiny figures in procession, all walking toward the door, all bringing gifts, all walking toward eternity. It wasn't just ceremony, it was comfort, a kind of reassurance for those who remained. The living could stand before the door and speak. They could light incense, murmur prayers, pour water across the shelf. They could call out names, and the Ka, hearing it, might stir from within the tomb, might drift forward, weightless as smoke, might press its presence against the veil of the world, close, but never seen. Some false doors had deep niches in the wall, shelves for offerings, grooves for draining libations, hollows where hundreds of hands had placed their care. Even now, archaeologists sometimes find traces, a smear of beer residue in a groove, ash from incense still clinging to the wall, seeds from old figs turned to dust, but not forgotten. They have found bowls turned upside down, as if the meal were over, or left open, as if expecting return. Not all false doors were grand. Some were humble, a simple slab of stone with a name scratched by hand. Even the poor, when they could, left space for the Ka to breathe, to pass in and out, to smell the bread once more, because memory in Egypt was nourishment, because forgetting was famine. And so, for centuries, the dead were fed, a ritual as rhythmic as the Nile, as certain as sunset, as soft as the steps of a daughter returning with honeyed cakes for a father long buried. Even in tombs now crumbled, even in vaults broken open by wind and grave robbers, the doors remain, breathless, but once they breathed. And perhaps, when the night grows still enough, they breathe again, and behind one of those doors, they placed something round and golden and warm. Not just a loaf, but a promise. Next comes the bread. Wheat turned to dust in the heat of the tomb, but still they brought more. Loaves shaped like suns, crescents, and cattle fodder. It was not just bread. It was resurrection in crust and crumb. To eat in the afterlife was to stay eternal, and to be forgotten was a second death. Full chapter text, 1,100 words. The Egyptians did not fear death as an end. They feared it as a hunger that lingered past burial, a hunger that could stretch across eternity if not remembered. And so, they fed the dead, patiently, lovingly, ritually, not with metaphor, but with bread. Bread was the thread between life and afterlife, not gold, not jewels. It was bread that mattered, soft loaves, warm from communal ovens, cradled in linen, hard biscuits for journeys, sun-dried and tough, offerings shaped like suns, crescents, cattle feed, crowns. Flour was memory, and baking was a form of prayer. Wheat was grown in the flood-rich soil left behind by the Nile. Each year, the river rose and receded like breath, and when it did, it left a gift, black earth, soft, thick, fertile. The Egyptians called it Kemet, the black land, the land of life. From that blackness came the grain, and from the grain came the loaves. Bakers rose before sunrise, their hands powdered in flour, their ovens dug low into clay. They shaped dough with water, with salt, sometimes with date pulp or honey, and as they baked, they knew some of these loaves would never be eaten. They would be carried, wrapped, placed beside the dead, because food was not for the body anymore. It was for the soul, for the Ka, the life force, which needed offerings to remain whole. And bread was the first offering, always. Sometimes it was real, molded, risen, charred. Other times it was painted on tomb walls or carved into stone altars. The idea of bread, the image of bread, was considered just as powerful, because the act of offering was what mattered. To place a loaf was to say, "You are still remembered, you are still fed." Archaeologists have found them, loaves thousands of years old, petrified, shrunken, still dusted with ancient flour. Some loaves were shaped with thumbprints still visible. Others bore impressions of baskets, reeds, fingers long vanished. There were loaves shaped like small domes, loaves that resembled cattle droppings, humble symbols of nourishment. Even loaves baked in molds shaped like the hieroglyph for life, the Ankh. Bread was sustenance, yes, but it was also spell work. It carried meaning beyond its crust. There was one particular loaf, baked in the shape of the rising sun, round, golden, with indentations like rays. To place this loaf was to summon morning, to offer renewal. There were breads baked for gods, and breads baked for scribes, and breads for midwives, boatmen, perfumers, farmers. The afterlife had many mouths to feed. In grand tombs, bread was everywhere, on shelves, on altars, in paintings. Sometimes the walls were covered with long inventories, a list of offerings stretching for meters: 50 loaves, 10 jars of beer, 2 geese, 1 ox leg, 7 onions, a basket of figs. It read like a grocery list, but it was holy. Even kings, surrounded by gold, guarded by statues, were fed with loaves. Tutankhamun's tomb held baskets of emmer wheat and hard cakes, enough perhaps for a journey beyond stars. And in simpler tombs too, bread remained the gift of choice. A farmer buried with nothing but a small offering table and 3 tiny loaves, his name already worn away, but the bread still there, hardened into silence. The act of placing it, that was the ceremony. Priests would walk into the chapel of the tomb. They would chant the offering formula, a voice offering of bread and beer, of ox and fowl, of alabaster and linen. The same words, again and again, like waves against stone. And the bread would be left, warm or cold, fresh or old. It did not matter, because to place it was to open the door, to remember, to nourish. There were spells in the Book of the Dead devoted just to bread, spells to ensure the soul could eat, spells to summon the scent of baking, spells to call for beer with the meal. The Egyptians imagined an afterlife that was not abstract, but lived in. It had fields to till, and rivers to cross, and sunrises to greet, and food to enjoy. To go hungry in that realm was to suffer. To go forgotten was worse. So families returned to tombs year after year. Long after the burial, they brought loaves from the same ovens they used for their own breakfast. Perhaps the same hands baked both, one for the living, one for the dead. Some loaves were never meant to feed. They were placed as symbols and then taken away. The priest would hold the bread toward the false door, speak the prayer, and then the loaf was carried back out to be eaten by the living or given to the poor. The spirit had taken its part, the unseen portion, the essence. The rest was no longer needed. It was a communion, not of magic, but of memory. In some tombs, the bread is still present, blackened, crumbled, but whole in shape. A loaf, thousands of years old, rests beside a skeleton. It has outlasted dynasties. It has waited in the dark, unbitten, but never unoffered. Because in Egypt, to feed the dead was to say, "You still matter. You are not lost. You have a place at the table of time." And just beyond the loaf stood a man in linen. He spoke to no one, but every tomb knew his voice. Next comes the priest. He walked without hurry, his sandals whispering against the limestone path. A linen tunic fluttered about his ankles, soft with age, sun-bleached. In one hand, He carried a palm leaf scroll. In the other, an offering tray of bread and beer. But it was not the bread that fed the dead. It was the voice. He was a priest of funerary service, one of many who served the realm of shadows, not temple priests who addressed the gods, but tomb priests, men of dust and memory, hired by the living to speak to the departed. Their job was quiet, rhythmic, bound to time, yet timeless. Day after day they visited tombs of nobles, scribes, officials, merchants. Some recently buried, some long past the reach of memory. They recited the names, they poured libations, they offered bread and beer and beef and greens. They listed each one aloud, not to inform the dead, but to remind the world they still mattered. Sometimes they sang the liturgies, sometimes they simply whispered, and sometimes they repeated a single line, again and again, until it melted into the walls, a voice offering of bread and beer. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking the name of the dead kept the soul intact. So the priest's voice became more than air. It became sustenance. His words fed the Ka, the vital spirit, not metaphorically, quite literally in their view. For a soul to thrive beyond death, it needed three things: a preserved body, a remembered name, and food. The priest could provide the last two. And so, they became custodians of the invisible. There were hundreds of them, walking in silence through necropolises like Saqqara and Giza. They bore no golden staffs. They led no festivals. But they were among the most essential keepers of the afterlife. They tended to offering chapels, dusted statues, poured water over worn stone altars, and they maintained the delicate thread between breath and silence. Sometimes they were paid with coins, or bread, or robes. Sometimes they were family members, sons and grandsons, fulfilling a duty across decades. Other times, they were professionals, hired through endowment contracts left by the deceased. These contracts could last years or centuries. In one tomb, the name of a long-dead administrator was still recited 4 generations after his burial, not because anyone remembered his face, but because the contract demanded it, and the priest obeyed. He stood before the false door and read, "For the revered one, the inspector of scribes, Mena." The walls bore Mena's image, seated before an offering table. Painted loaves, onions, jars of beer. Painted musicians played flutes and harps. Painted servants brought baskets of figs and goose meat. But all of it was hollow without the voice. It was the priest's words that animated the scene, that called the Ka to eat. Some priests were specialists in mortuary rites. They memorized long recitations from the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and later, the Book of the Dead. They knew how to open the mouth of a statue, how to wash a slab with natron and perfume, how to speak to a soul without waking anything else. Their tools were few: a staff, a vessel for incense, a scroll or two, and time, because time, too, was a form of offering. Each visit was a ritual, slow, unchanging, faithful. Each act was a kind of loyalty. Even as tombs collapsed, even as names eroded into silt, the priests came. In Thebes, one priest visited a noble woman's tomb every month for 40 years. He left baskets of lentils and wine, and he wrote her name again and again on ostraca, shards of pottery used like paper. No one asked him to keep doing it. But still he did, because she had fed him once, because her kindness had not turned to dust. Even priests, after all, would someday require remembering. And so, it was circular. The living fed the dead. The dead, in return, blessed the living with peace, with dreams, with crops that grew tall. The priest's voice made it so. The chants they used were formulaic, intentionally so. Repetition created resonance. Repetition made memory strong. May you eat bread from the table of the gods. May your name never fall silent. May your ka rise with the morning sun. Over and over, like wind against stone. Soft enough to be forgotten, strong enough to endure. There were tombs with no visitors, no family left, no contracts remaining. But sometimes, a priest would stop anyway. He would pour water on the altar, leave a date or a dried fish, speak a name even if he could not pronounce it clearly. Because to feed one forgotten soul was to remind the others, we are not abandoned. Even now, in the ruins of Saqqara, there are walls where names still cling. And in the stillness, it is easy to imagine them. A man in linen, standing before a carved door, a shadow stretching long behind him, a tray balanced in his palm, his mouth forming syllables last spoken 3,000 years ago. The wind carries nothing, but in the quiet, you might still hear it. A voice offering of bread and beer, of oxen and linen, and cool water for the throat. He fed them not with hands, but with breath. And somewhere in the tomb's silence, the soul stirred, and once, in the crook of his arm, he carried something scented, not for the gods, but for the nose of the dead. Next comes the spice. They could no longer chew. Their tongues had long since turned to dust, and yet the dead still received flavor. Because in Egypt, scent was nourishment, and spice was memory made visible. Not everything placed at the offering table was meant to be eaten. Some things were meant to be smelled, because the nose, the Egyptians believed, was a gateway for the ka. The soul could inhale what the body could not consume. And so, the tombs filled with perfume and dust. Small bowls of coriander, placed carefully beside the loaves. Garlic bulbs, plump and drying in the still air. Bundles of dried mint and dill. Figs split open to release sweetness into silence. Cumin and fenugreek, sesame and thyme. It was not a banquet. It was an atmosphere. Spice lingered longer than bread. Its oil soaked into limestone. Its scent lived even when the fruit had rotted away. Some tombs became botanical archives, not by design, but because scent leaves traces. Because the dead, if they could breathe, would breathe with longing. In the tomb of a noble named Ka, buried in the 18th dynasty, archaeologists found a sealed jar. When opened, thousands of years later, it still smelled faintly of myrrh, a whisper of the past, preserved in resin. There were perfumes too, pressed from lilies and sacred blue lotus, mixed with unguents and oils, poured gently over the offering slabs like holy honey. To smell a thing was to remember it, to name it, to rejoin it. Coriander was often used for the high-born, sharp, citrus-laced and ancient. Its seeds were found scattered in the wrappings of mummies, not to preserve, but to accompany, to guide. It was said that coriander grew in the gardens of the gods, and to offer it to the dead was to give them a scent from home. Onions were left too, layered and pungent, sometimes whole, sometimes braided into garlands and worn by the embalmed. A builder might receive onions. A farmer might be offered leeks. These were not extravagant things. They were the smells of the real world, of life, of kitchens and fields. The dead, they believed, missed those smells most. The scent of boiling lentils, of spiced bread dough rising, of dates pressed into cakes. Not the scent of gold, nor myrrh, but the scent of breakfast. The tombs were filled with such echoes. Some burial sites contained small clay models of spice jars, carefully labeled, not for use, but as symbols. The presence of smell was more important than the object itself. There was a deep belief in the magical essence of aroma, that which could not be seen yet lingered long after the offering had vanished. Some priests performed fumigation rituals, burning frankincense, acacia, and sweet grass. The smoke would rise through cracks in the stone, curling along the false door. It was believed that the ka could follow it, like breath moving backward through time. The tomb became a censer, a bowl for sacred air, and all of it was meant to welcome. In some tombs, archaeologists found dishes shaped like lotuses, small ceramic petals cupping grains of scented resin. Other graves held dried petals tucked into linen bundles, like letters folded with care. And yes, even flowers were food for the nose. The blue lotus, sacred to the Nile, was more than a bloom. It was an offering of dreaming. It opened in the morning, closed at night, mirroring the sun, the soul, the cycle. To smell it was to be reminded of rising, of return. Some believed the dead could smell the offerings, and that was enough. A single whiff of a favorite spice could soothe the soul for another 1,000 years. It was a kind of gentle hospitality, as if to say, "We did not forget your favorite fruit. We brought the honey cakes you liked. We crushed the mint like we always did, when the air turned warm." There was no way to confirm the dead had received these scents, no way to know if the offerings reached across that invisible line. But they did it anyway, because ritual is stronger than proof, because memory is a form of faith. Even now, in the Museum of Turin, you can see a tray of dried food from Ka and his wife Merit, a bowl of preserved figs, a handful of lentils, and beside them, tiny spice seeds, still shaped, still whole, still waiting. They are over 3,000 years old, no longer edible, but not forgotten. They remind us, taste fades, scent lingers. And so the priests returned each season, placing new offerings, lighting new incense, letting the fragrance bloom in the darkness. It was not for the living anymore. It was for the invisible breath of the tomb. And in one tomb, there was no food at all, only a stone table carved with bowls and meat and figs. Next comes the banquet made of stone. The tomb was silent, but the table was set, not with silver, not with cloth, but with stone, cool, pale, unmoving, still waiting after all these years. In the chambers of the dead, the Egyptians crafted meals that could not rot, not out of bread or onion or fig or beer, but out of limestone and paint. It was called an offering table, hitep in their language, a word that also meant peace, because to eat was to rest, to be fed was to be safe. These tables were carved and placed before the false door, between worlds, a surface where the needs of the soul could be met, not with hands, but with symbols. Often, the stone itself was shaped into the items it portrayed. Half a goose sliced down the center, loaves of bread in tall stacks, jars of wine etched in relief, sometimes even a cluster of grapes rendered with such care that the dimples of each berry still remain. The stone didn't pretend to be edible. It didn't need to. In Egypt, the representation of a thing could nourish the spirit just as well as the thing itself. A carved cut of beef was as meaningful to the Ka as a real one. A limestone fish, frozen in its final curve, could still be tasted, if not with the mouth, then with memory. These tables were simple in shape, flat slabs, usually rectangular, supported by a short base. But their faces were crowded with carvings. One section might hold 2 ducks laid side by side, their wings folded peacefully. Another might show jars stacked vertically, one for beer, one for water, one for perfume. Lines were cut to mimic trays, bowls, baskets. The surface became a still life of sustenance, a ghostly banquet, heavy and cold. In some cases, hieroglyphs were added beside the items, labels, menus, prayers, bread, 100 pieces, beer, sweet, 10 jars, lettuce, fine, in season, salt, 1 pinch. The measurements didn't matter, the gesture did. Each carved meal was part of a larger composition, the eternal meal, to feed the Ka for 1,000 years, to nourish the soul long after living hands had vanished. Some offering tables were inscribed with the standard funerary formula, a sentence found in tomb after tomb, repeated so often it became a kind of magic. An offering which the king gives. It was a way of saying the king himself approved this meal, that the gods had sanctioned the nourishment, that this was not just sculpture, it was sanctioned sustenance. There were no forks or knives, no need. The spirit didn't eat as the body did. It absorbed, it remembered. The offering table was not a place for indulgence. It was a place of continuity, a place where the family might kneel, light incense, pour water, say the names, and where, somewhere between the carving of onions and the image of dates, a whisper of the dead might rise. Some tables were elaborate, with dozens of items. Others were humble, a single loaf or a round cake marked with dots. But each one was made with intention. Even the smallest tombs had them. Even those buried in the hillsides or the sandy outskirts, people of modest means, would leave a stone dish behind, etched with a handful of lines. Bread and beer, meat and greens. A complete meal, even if no meal had ever been served there. In many cases, the tables were stained, not just with time, but with ritual. Dark streaks from wine or oil, smoky smudges from incense, residue from repeated water offerings poured again and again over decades. Each stain was a mark of memory, of a daughter who came at dusk with a basket of barley, of a grandson who murmured names before the stone. Over time, the tables sank beneath layers of dust, sometimes beneath the sand itself. They were covered, forgotten, lost, and yet they waited. And when archaeologists uncovered them, they found not only the shapes of food, but the hunger for remembrance. In one tomb, the offering table had a shallow groove cut through the center. It was made to guide water, poured from a vessel toward a small depression, a symbolic washing, a ceremonial drink. Even in sculpture, thirst could be quenched. In another, the table had tiny depressions shaped like lotus petals. Each one once held oil, or scent, or nothing at all, just the idea of it. And still, that was enough. In the cool shadows of the tomb, among jars turned to powder and paint, flaking like old skin, the offering tables endure, immobile, but not empty, because in their stillness, they still feed the dead, not with taste, but with presence, with shape, with memory. It was art, but it was more than that. It was faith in form, and even now, 3,000 years after the last loaf was placed, they remain set. A table beneath the sand, a banquet of stone, a silence that smells faintly of coriander and dust. But what if the food was not sculpted? What if it was only painted, on walls that the living would never see again? Next comes the feast in pigment. The walls were the table now. No stone trays, no sculpted loaves, just paint, just color, just quiet. In the tombs of Egypt, they began to paint the meals, not to impress or to decorate, but to nourish, to sustain. In place of offerings carved in limestone, they laid banquets across the walls, spreads of food so vivid they seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. The pigments were ground from the earth, ochre for bread, malachite for greens, soot for wine, crushed and mixed with egg or gum, brushed gently over plaster, layer by layer, dish by dish. In some tombs, the entire west wall was devoted to the feast. Long tables of the afterlife, arranged in perfect rows, each bearing bowls and platters and jars. There were fish, with silver scales painted one by one, cucumbers, long and pale, figs split open at the seam, lettuce painted in swaying stalks, tall and delicate, symbols of rebirth, and bread, always bread, drawn in high stacks like miniature pyramids, each loaf dotted, notched, or ridged to show what kind it was. Egypt had many breads, flat and risen, round, twisted, spiral, some for daily meals, others only for the tomb. The artists painted them all, not loosely, not hastily, but with reverence, because to paint a food was to offer it, to record it was to make it real, even in death. Above the table scenes, lines of hieroglyphs listed the contents: beer, fine and filtered; beef, rare; wine from the western oasis; milk from the white cow. Each item painted once, but imagined forever. Some of these painted feasts followed a specific pattern. The oldest version showed the 7 sacred oils laid out in a row with little copper bowls drawn beneath. Others showed the deceased seated beside the table, calm, ageless, dressed in linen, their hand raised to a dish, frozen mid-meal. Sometimes the spouse was shown too, sharing the meal, or a child bringing more food, a soft, eternal family supper. The perspective was impossible. Jars were seen from the side, tables from above, bread in perfect front view. It made the scene feel dreamlike, flattened by eternity. But it didn't matter. Clarity wasn't the point. Presence was. The banquet was meant to be remembered by the soul, not seen by the living. In one tomb, the painter added a detail not found in others. A small dog curled beneath the table, painted in red and black, with one paw tucked under. No label, no name, just a quiet witness to the meal. The offerings in paint went beyond food. There were also perfumes, lotus blossoms, linens folded in bundles, coal jars, and even board games laid out and ready to play. Because the afterlife was not just survival, it was joy, comfort, abundance. The artists painted to ensure it. They were not muralists, they were priests of pigment. Their brushes were soft reeds, chewed into frayed ends. Their palettes were slabs of wood, daubed with colored circles. They worked in silence, bent close to the walls, guided by ritual, not fame. They never signed their names, yet their work endured. Thousands of years later, the walls still whisper, faintly but clearly. In a tomb at Saqqara, a feast scene still stretches across the plaster. The meats are darkened by age, the fruits dulled, but the shapes remain. A goose with its neck bent just so, a table with legs that end in lion paws, a bowl of pomegranates, each seed implied by a red dot. It is enough to make the room feel full, not of scent, not of flavor, but of memory, because memory was what they painted, not the meal as it was, but the idea of it, a feast as it should be, abundant, welcoming, unending. The walls held what stone could not. They held movement, a servant pouring beer mid-tilt, a woman handing dates across a table, a scribe noting down supplies in perfect inked lines. The figures were stylized, but tender, always in profile, always elegant, always calm. The tomb was a banquet hall, but also a prayer that the ka would never hunger, that the mouth would always taste, that the eyes would always see the color of wine. In some tombs, a final detail was added near the painted meals, a small image of the offering priest. He stood in the corner, one hand raised, his body facing forward, his face in profile. frozen in the act of giving. He was not the one who painted, but the one who spoke, the one who chanted the names of each dish aloud so the soul might receive them, so the food might not be forgotten, even in silence, even in sleep, even in stone. The painted banquet did not rot, it did not spoil, it did not require replacement. It simply endured, layered beneath sand, hidden from light, but still intact, still offering, because to the ancient Egyptians, memory could feed, color could nourish, and paint, soft and dry upon plaster, could be enough. Enough for the dead, enough for forever. But the dead did not always stay quiet. Sometimes they answered, and the living left notes to keep them still. Next, whispers from the necropolis. They say the dead were quiet, but that was never entirely true. In Egypt's necropolises, silence had texture, not absence, but tension, as if the stones held breath. The air was thin in these resting places, dry, still. The desert wrapped the tombs like gauze, but among the dust and the rubble, there were messages, soft ones, scratched ones, left not by the dead, but for them. Some were carved into limestone with trembling hands, others painted quickly in ink on bowls, on broken pots, on scraps of stone. They were letters, letters to the deceased, and the living left them like offerings. The practice was quiet and ancient. By the time the pyramids were ruins, Egyptians were already writing to their dead. They called them letters to the netherworld. And though time wore away the names, the voices remained. One fragment, found near Thebes, began plainly. Tell my father this, that I am ill, that I have no health in the house you left me, that my brother takes the grain. It was not poetic, not ceremonial. It was a complaint, a cry, a whisper scratched in haste. Another fragment was more urgent. I made your offerings. I poured the water. Why then do you send fever to my child? The tomb had become a postbox, and the letters were written in hope that the soul might listen, might remember, might stop. Because while the dead needed bread, the living needed peace. If illness came, if cattle failed, if dreams turned sour, they sometimes blamed the restless spirits, not gods, not fate, but kin. So they wrote. They wrote to grandmothers, to first wives, to forgotten brothers buried without a feast. Stop troubling me, one ostracon pleads. I burned incense in your name. Let me sleep. The messages were placed carefully, tucked near the burial shaft, laid flat on the ground like a final word. There was no guarantee the dead could read them, but symbols, like food, had power. Some letters included little drawings, a bowl of water, a loaf of bread, an eye to show seeing, a foot to show walking. They weren't just complaints. Some were full of longing. Mother, I remember the stew. I remember the blue beads in your hair. The house is quiet without your sandals. The necropolis, despite its name, was not a city of the dead. It was a city of messages, of ongoing ties, of grief shaped into grammar. Even tomb robbers left notes, crude ones. In one desecrated burial, a message was scratched on the wall. Forgive us. We took only what we needed. May your Ka not be angry. A thief asking pardon. A whisper to the bones. These were not prayers to gods. They were negotiations. Family arguments continued across eternity. And sometimes the dead answered, not with voices, but with silence that shifted, with dreams that unsettled, with illnesses that lingered only in one house. It was enough to stir fear. One man, a scribe named Noct, wrote, I dreamed of your sandals at the doorway. I dreamed of your cough, though you are dust. I leave this wine so you may drink and sleep and forget me. The letter was written on the back of an accounting list. Practicality married to longing. The living clung to ritual. When logic failed, they turned to form, to ink, to symbols, to old words passed down, because to be heard was to be real. And perhaps deep in the earth, beneath baskets of grain, beneath painted loaves and curled fish, perhaps someone was listening. The act of writing was protective. It softened guilt. It preserved memory. And the letters, left in the dust of the necropolis, were never retrieved. They weren't meant to be. Like ancient voicemail, they simply echoed, and the tombs collected them. Collected emotion, collected disappointment, collected love in its most brittle form. Some letters tried flattery. You who were so just. You who gave me figs when I was small. Others warned, return not in the night. I placed amulets at the door. One even included a request. Tell the one buried near you to stop calling my name. As if the tombs were neighbors, as if the dead conversed, and gossip drifted through corridors of limestone. The language of the letters changed over centuries. Old Egyptian, Demotic, Coptic, Arabic even. But the intention stayed. Whispers on potsherds, grief sealed in ink. Archaeologists called them funerary communications. But that was too clean a phrase. These were not communications. They were attachments, bindings, knots of memory left at the foot of stone doors. And they remind us that ancient mourning wasn't always solemn. Sometimes it was messy. Sometimes it was frustrated. Sometimes it asked the dead to behave. Because even in the afterlife, family was family. And the necropolis, for all its grandeur, was just a neighborhood of memories. Dusty, stubborn, human. But beyond the words and offerings, there were guardians. Not living, not dead, only watching. Next, the one who listens from the wall. In the corners of ancient tombs, beyond the sealed doors and offerings, stood the watchers. They were not men, not ghosts, not gods. They were something in between. Some were painted on plaster, others carved into the stone. Figures frozen in mid-glance, eyes rimmed in black coal, shoulders squared. Not servants, not pharaohs, just watchers. The Egyptians did not believe in silence, not in the places of the dead. There, even a glance could carry weight. And so, they painted eyes. They sculpted heads that turned. They added ears to the sides of shrines. Because the dead, it was said, must be watched, but also must be heard. Tombs were not locked boxes. They were rooms still inhabited, and within them, figures waited in stillness for eternity. They were called by many names: eyes of Horus, listening statues, silent companions. Each served a purpose: to hear the prayers, to witness the offerings, to see if any promise was broken. Most were small, deliberate, easy to miss. A pair of obsidian eyes set in limestone, a little ear etched into a niche, a figure kneeling with open hands, forever mid-receive. Some tombs had dozens, others had one. But there is one that has never stopped watching. Buried beneath layers of sand and soot, in a tomb carved in the cliffs near Asyut, there sits a figure, painted in red and black, with eyes too wide. Its gaze was said to follow, even now. Archaeologists called it the listener, not because it had ears, but because offerings were found at its feet, offerings left long after the tomb had been sealed. Tiny cups, spoons, pebbles shaped like ears, pieces of dried bread. No name was written on the wall, no inscription of purpose, just that painted figure, kneeling, silent, and always, always watching. Some believe the listener was a servant to the dead. Others say it was a guardian, a witness to promises made in whispers, but stories lingered among the workers that if one entered the tomb alone, they would hear a breath that was not their own, that if they stood too close, they would remember voices not spoken aloud in years. Some laughed until they entered and exited quiet. There were no curses in the tomb, no snakes, no spells etched into the lintel, only that painted figure and the silence it guarded, because silence in Egypt was a tool, a shield, a warning. The listener did not speak, but it gathered and it remembered. In a way, it became the tomb's soul, a symbol that memory does not decay, that eyes do not close simply because the body rests. Other tombs had their watchers too. In Saqqara, one burial shaft revealed a statue carved from sycamore, its hands cupped near its mouth, as if whispering. The locals called it the telltale, because the dead had secrets, and someone had to keep them. Elsewhere, in a priest's tomb outside Karnak, the entire north wall was covered in ears, carved in rows, dozens of them, big and small. The priest had hoped the gods would listen, but perhaps he feared someone else would too. Offerings were left below the ears, a bit of water, a flower, a torn piece of cloth, not for the gods, not for the priest, but for the watchers, to keep them calm, to keep them still. Because watching, in death, was not always passive. It could be protective, or vengeful, or simply enduring. Even the humble Ushabti, tiny servant statues left in tombs, sometimes had their faces scraped off, just in case they woke up, just in case they remembered too much. Memory, after all, was dangerous, and in Egypt, it lived in paint and pigment, in limestone and lapis, in soot and bone. And the figures on the walls, they were not dead. They simply waited to see if the bread was offered, if the names were spoken, if the rituals were followed. And when they weren't, they noticed, and dreams turned bitter. One letter, left anonymously in a tomb at Abydos, said, "You watched me take the amulet. I return it now. Please unsee me." The listener had no mouth, no reply, just wide inked eyes that did not blink. And when the wind howled through the cliffside shaft, it echoed as if through hollow mouths, as if the watchers exhaled. And still they stood, still they knelt, still they waited. They were the record keepers of ritual, of grief, of hunger. And while the priests spoke the names and the families left their bowls, it was the watchers who noticed the gaps, the days forgotten, the wine soured, the lies, because every tomb was a contract between memory and time, and someone had to enforce it, not with punishment, but with presence, unmoving, unblinking, unrelenting, eyes in the wall, ears in the dust, figures that gathered what was said and unsaid, not gods, not demons, just the quiet enforcement of eternity. And the listener, that one figure near Asyut, remains to this day. Its colors faded, its wall cracked, but the eyes, still there, still open, still listening, to wind, to footsteps, to the rustle of paper when tourists drop notes at its feet. No signs encourage it, but still, they do. Help me dream of her. I miss my father. If you see anything, please show me. The messages remain, piled gently beneath the gaze, because even now, even in this modern hour, we still want to be seen, to be remembered, to be heard, even by a figure in pigment 4,000 years old. But long before the listener's wall was painted, the ovens had already cooled, and the loaves, meant for the afterlife, were already crumbling into dust. In time, even stone forgets. Even the best baked bread crumbles to dust, and tombs once fed by prayer begin to hollow. The offerings, stopped, Not all at once, but slowly. A generation missed a festival. A priest died and was not replaced. The children moved north, and the name was no longer spoken aloud. And so the tomb grew quiet. There had once been warmth, even laughter. Priests kneeling in candlelight, spooning honey into tiny bowls. Wives whispering memories as they brushed the statue's shoulders. Songs played for ancestors whose bones were wrapped in linen and longing. And above it all, the scent of baked bread, loaves shaped like fish, like flowers, like little folded hands. But bread, like memory, spoils when neglected. And tombs, they notice. In Abydos, one tomb was sealed shut not once, but 3 times. Each generation reopened it, cleaned it, left offerings, then forgot again. When the last seal broke, centuries later, archaeologists found nothing inside but crumbs of real barley, pressed flat, preserved only by dryness and luck. Fragments of a loaf never touched by the dead but left, lovingly, long ago, by hands now also gone. And still, the ritual mattered, even if only once. Because in Egypt, to offer was to remember, to bake was to believe. It did not guarantee eternal life, but it suggested something quieter, that the line between life and afterlife was a long table with empty chairs, and sometimes someone still set the table. Even now, some desert winds carry seeds, literal seeds, spelled from ancient barley, blown from crumbled tomb baskets into soft dunes. Archaeobotanists found them, near Thebes, near Saqqara, even in the folds of old linen wrappers. Little ghosts of crops once meant to feed kings after death. Some of those seeds were revived, planted in modern soil, watered, coaxed, and some grew. Barley from a burial pit, wheat from the pouch of a priest, coriander, fennel, leeks, not superstition, just science. But the fact remained. The food of the afterlife still lives. Somewhere in a field, there's a stalk that sprouted from a forgotten tomb, a plant whose ancestor was meant to feed the dead. But instead, it reached sunlight again. And that's the strange grace of it. Even in a lost ritual, something persists. The act of kneading, the way fingers remember the weight of dough, the echo of incense in narrow halls. It lingers, in kitchens, in ovens, in lullabies about bread and stars. Even in languages that forgot their gods, they remember the loaves. Flat bread, sun-dried, saltless, like the desert. In one Coptic hymn, sung centuries after the pyramids had faded, there's a line that translates to, "Feed the ones who dream." It wasn't about the dead, not directly, but the rhythm was old, and maybe the tombs still dream. Empty now, carved names worn by wind and time. Some have been looted, others collapsed, but a few remain intact. Their walls still bright, their air still dry, their shelves still holding small stone bowls meant for lentils and cake. And while no priest walks there, sometimes a bat flutters in. Sometimes a breeze moves the dust. And somewhere in that breath, a memory shifts. Not a ghost, not a haunting, just the afterlife adjusting its coat and waiting. Because time does not erase the need, only buries it. And so long as a name is spoken, even in mispronunciation, even in awe, some part of that person lives. Egyptians believed in the second death, the final, true death, when no one remembers your name. And the rituals were built to delay it. The bread, the ink, the chant, all of it, a hedge against forgetting. And even now, in museums, children press their noses to glass cases, peering at loaves baked 4,000 years ago. Still there, brown, misshapen, labeled with numbers and dates. But once, they were warm. Once, they were scented with cumin and coriander. Once, a mother shaped them with thumb and palm, whispered the name, wrapped it gently, and set it at the foot of a wooden box where her father now slept. And she believed truly, that he would taste it, that he would smile even in death, that love could cross that line. And maybe it did, because love, like ritual, is a stubborn thing. It outlives language, outlives empires, and in quiet places, in tombs and ruins, it leaves behind traces, crumbs, little remnants of belief, of memory, of hunger. And while the priests are gone and the rites are faded, the story still lingers, not loud, not urgent, but soft, like breath through linen, like wind beneath stone, like a lullaby hummed in a kitchen long after the child has gone to sleep. And so, we end where we began, with bread, with the dead, with a story wrapped in silence. And somewhere, in a tomb not yet found, a loaf still waits, cracked, quiet, and whole, as if the offering was never missed at all. Hey, if your eyes are heavy now, let them stay closed a little longer. We've drifted far tonight, through ovens and tombs, through the warmth of bread and the hush of stone. Somewhere in history, someone still waits to be remembered, and somehow, your breath carried them back. If stories like this help you rest, you can follow this channel for more. No rush, maybe after the dream. The candles have all burned low, the names have been whispered, and now we sleep. Good night from the Sleepy History Channel. The past will keep.